Welcome, dear Jungians, colleagues and friends. This is our fourth digital saloon, the Psychosocial Wednesday, which has been initiated by Paula Tinello, Stefano Carbani, and myself, Bernhard von Goretzky. Its idea reflects for its famous Psychologische Mittwochsgesellschaft in Vienna, which started in 1902, and Jung's Psychologischer Club 15 years later in Zurich. Our salon is some sort of Corona creation, and it gives us an opportunity to meet every other week or later on every month to present speakers on a variety of topics and have open, fruitful discussions. That's for the Wednesday part. But what about the psychosocial part? The worldwide lockdown due to Corona definitely changed our view on the society we live in, its economy and its social interactions. A new perspective, a new stance is needed. Therefore, we are pleased to announce our speaker today, Andrew Samuels, as he can be seen as a representative of the psychosocial turn, which might provide new perspectives. Andrew is an activist, analyst, professor emeritus of Essex University, who has worked as a consultant with politicians, political parties, and radical groups in several countries. In Britain, this has included the Labour Party, the National Health Service, and the Financial Services Authority. He has been writing about economic matters for many years. Before we start, I would like to play a video by the Rolling Stones, which was filmed during the lockdown, and I'm sure the title and the kind of their performance will set the scene for the talk.
You can't always get what you want. You can't always get what you want. You can't always get what you want. But if you try sometimes, well, you might find you get what you need. That was written in 1969. In 1967, in the United States, there was the long, hot summer. There were race riots. I was there, actually. We all know what 1968 means. So I suggest we are seeing a new old thing unfolding in Western politics, a new old thing. And thank God the kids are there again. Here's a summary. It's got 3 sections. The first one is called You Can't Always Get What You Want. The second is entitled Can We Have Relational Economics? And the third is called Sacrifice and Sadism. So you can't always get what you want. Economics is at the basis of almost everything that we are concerned with this evening. It's at the base of the climate crisis. It's at the base of the unequal experience of COVID-19. And it sure as hell underpins a great deal of what's happening in relation to Black Lives Matter. Economics and political violence have for 350 years and maybe forever been seriously interlinked. And there is an economic factor when we consider what women's disadvantage in the world amounts to. Economics is at the basis of power. And I think all the matters that exercise us these days have a lot to do with power. Now, I personally doubt there will be another Great Depression with unemployment at 25%. But I think it will be bad enough. And outside the developed economies in the West, in Africa and in Latin America, it will be catastrophic. Even in the United States now, unemployment is running at about 13.5%. Most commentators in the UK think that Britain will hit 20% when government assistance for ongoing employment ceases. I'm going to try not to perform as an intelligent journalist and tell you lots of things you know already, so I'll just go over them very quickly. Most people know that economic inequalities between individuals have increased in the last 200 years and even more so in the last 50. And something that has not been commentated on very much, but is absolutely central, is that rich people marry each other. And this is a huge psychological as well as practical obstacle to economic justice and equality. If you want to Google the growing but still not very extensive literature on this, Google assortative mating, assortative mating. It is a very interesting example of how personal behaviors and public policy and realities interact. Another thing I think that we might all share is that whether you're positive about it or negative about it, societies based on profit and involving the earning of interest are bound to be unequal societies. But I want to get outside the Western box this evening, and especially outside the Anglophone countries of the US and the UK. The founder of the internet, the World Wide Web, Tim Berners-Lee, wrote an article recently in which he said in Africa, only 1 in 4 people can access the web. Actually, 60,000 children in the UK have no internet at home. In the US, 12 million children live in houses without reliable broadband or without broadband at all. So when we say everything is online, everything is on Zoom, I'm seeing all my patients on Skype or Zoom or some sexy, trendy platform, be aware that this is not how it is for very many people. The question that interests me is, why can't those of us with ideas and ideals for reform or even for revolution get what we want? Why can't we achieve our goals? What stops it? Well, it could be the capitalists. It could be the financiers. Or could it be something wider and more psychological? What stops economic reform? And whether you like taxation policy as a topic of conversation or not, what stops taxation? For example, a tax on financial transactions from coming about? What stops sustainable economics from becoming anything other than a post-viral hope? What stops the idea of a universal basic income be taken up by Western governments when it seems in some ways to be an obvious idea? What stops us achieving economic as well as other equalities? What stops us achieving equality? And why do we accept what Jesus said? The poor will always be with you. The role of therapy thinking and depth psychology in relation to politics is to pick up on obstacles to change, on obstacles to bringing ideas and ideals to fruition. Therapists are much less good at proposing things, but we are quite competent, because it's what we do, at understanding what blocks things from happening. So what do people want after the virus? Well, some people clearly want a return to normality and business as usual, get the economy going again, and then in a way, after a period of immense suffering, we can behave as if nothing happened. A lot of people want that, but a lot don't. Let's think about Extinction Rebellion, what remains of Occupy, and above all these days, of Black Lives Matter. These are important movements in Western societies, and people who participate in them do not want a return to normality and business as usual. What does this mean? It means that a God Almighty political battle looms. And I think therapists need to come out and say where they stand in groups and as individuals in relation to this political battle. I'd like to look at a couple of ethnic and national themes in relation to what's going on in economic thinking and activity with this political struggle in mind. And that, by the way, is why I began with 67, 68, 69. It ain't new. It's old, but it's also, in a way, new. In 2009, the then president of Brazil, Lula, said to consternation in the developed countries that the economic crash was the responsibility of white men with blue eyes, and that Black people's role was to be the victims. Many were shocked, but I think that necessary ethnic dimension is ever more relevant. Lula was saying, and I agree, and I think it's even more true in the last 6 months, that it was whiteness that developed the mind-body split, whiteness that instigated a great deal of global warming and unsustainable economics, nuclear technology, and the free market. It's white people who get the bonus in the pay packet. It's whiteness that can contemplate brown and Black people dying as if they mattered less than white people. And at the time in 2009, many brown people were being killed in a kind of video arcade by unpiloted drones steered from underground chambers thousands of miles away in the US. And that was ordered by Barack Obama. Now, brown and Black people get killed on the streets. I'm saying from an economic point of view, race and ethnicity play out in myriad ways according to history and cultural context. But I think we have to contend with this constant whiteness, American whiteness, Western whiteness. These whitenesses have been allowed to become essentialized, universalized, removed from history. Now, the problem for those of us interested in economics, money, and class is that the ethnic bias, the ethnic tilt, the global ethnic unlevel playing field is a huge, huge difficulty. You can't sit in a think tank and devise new economic policies, quantitative easing, manipulation of interest rates, flooding the economy with dollars or sterling or whatever, without thinking about whiteness. Whiteness is really, really important. That's the opening section. We can't always get what we want. The second, you may remember, was called relational economics. I'd like to share an anecdote about a workshop exercise that I still do, although the anecdote stems from about 15 years ago in a big American city. I wanted to get people to speak about themselves in economic and monetary terms. The audience was a mixture of Jungian analysts and academics and people involved in think tank life. It was a sophisticated audience. So I began by saying, I'm Andrew. I earn £110,000 a year. My assets are worth, net of mortgages, £350,000 a year. I spend a great deal of money on theatre, opera, ballet, and on wine. And the group was a little bit surprised, and yet they understood that being an economic person is fundamental. We are economic agents, subjects, beings. So gradually, people started to express themselves economically. Now, this is, of course, very interesting from a therapy point of view, but I won't go there with this anecdote. What then happened really sticks in my mind. A gentleman in the audience, he was, I noticed, the only one wearing a suit, got to his feet and he walked to the center of the room, into the middle of the circle, and said, I'm a tax attorney, and I advise all of you not to participate in this exercise. And the reason why he advised this was it could be dangerous. It could expose things about yourself that you may not want to have exposed. So you see, we can talk in public about spirituality. We can talk in public about sex and gender. We can talk in public about aggression, envy. We can talk in public about hope or pessimism, but it's very difficult to talk personally in public about money. What can depth psychology contribute to economic thinking? Well, I have to begin by saying, as I always say, on its own, very little. It's really important that therapists who want to make a difference in this kind of area of human life and experience find other groups of people with different knowledge bases to do it with. On our own, we can't really pass muster. But something that does interest therapists is what economists call the human nature debate. The human nature debate is very simple. Is the human subject competitive, aggressive, greedy, ruthless, or is the human subject altruistic, collaborative, community-minded, or is the human subject a mixture of these? Economists are not terribly good at having that debate. I think we could contribute a lot to it. And I do think there are prospects for a more relational approach to economics, where the emotional impact of economic decision-making is looked at in a more thorough way and higher up the agenda. There are so many ideas around. I don't know how many of you know about Sharia finance, which is the Islamic approach to finance that eschews, doesn't want anything to do with interest because that's forbidden. And there are ideas around about global commons. The global commons would be land, water, air. These things maybe should not be privatized or be part of private property. Actually, the economic crisis has stimulated so much new thinking about economics that I think it's really our mentor at the moment. That's the end of the second section on relational economics. I should reassure you, this is a short talk. one of the things about Zoom is that it has a battery life. The third section is called, in a friendly way, Sadism and Sacrifice. I want to begin with a thought about class as social class, as an inner world phenomenon. And I would just like to remind you that you will know by now, I'm very interested in assortative mating in which rich people fuck one another and marry one another, and concentration of power a la Thomas Piketty is greatly enhanced. One of the things I'm learning in my clinical work is that the question of doing better than your parents, doing better economically, whatever better means, it usually means being more successful in conventional terms, is a very difficult matter. These days, we know our children are not doing better than us. If us means people between 40 and 80. They're not. But the basic assumption is that people will do better than their parents. It's the promise of late capitalism. But it's psychologically extremely tricky for people to negotiate. Turning to Freudian theory at the moment, I think that Oedipal victory, doing better than your parents, is a very difficult thing to manage. And that means that there is a pathology of success which is buried, and which I see it as the mission of therapists to excavate and bring into the public sphere. Now I'm going to ask you to do a very short exercise. This is the bit on your inner billionaire that you may have read in my blurb. It's really about economic sadism. Imagine you have won the world's greatest lottery. You have received instantly untold wealth. Let's imagine it a bit further. Let's dream the exercise on. Trillions. You've got trillions. Now, it wouldn't be difficult to draw you out on all the good things you would do with your windfall. But what I'm finding in workshops is that it's very interesting to ask people to fantasize about the bad things they do. Let your fantasies, do it now as I'm talking, let your fantasies of doing harm, of exploiting others, of hurting your neighbors, let those fantasies come up. We're all Jungians, this is the shadow. What comes up? In workshops, people say things like, I'd hire a hitman to kill, I don't know, Trump, or some awful Wall Street person who has fiddled his books and so on and so forth. I'm not sure that's what I've got in mind when I really ask for people to connect with their economic sadism. Let me give you a couple of examples as a sort of stimulus, because I hope you're doing it. Bad stuff, not good stuff. At the workshop in the American city that I mentioned, a professor at the university that was hosting the event said, as his example of his personal economic sadism, well, I would purchase 500 square miles of prime skiing land at Aspen. For those who don't know, Aspen is a very posh American skiing resort. And I thought, oh, bloody hell, if that's the worst you can be, you've got a serious problem, mate. And then this chap, possessed by some inner force, got to his feet and said, and I would hire the US Marine Corps to shoot dead anybody that came within 200 yards of my land. That was better.
Yeah.
The worst one, and I'm going to say it in consciousness that it will upset people, was someone who said, I would use my trillions to create a situation in which I could have sex with underage children. It's a fantasy, folks. Now, why am I telling you all this shit? Because I think this kind of sadism is very widespread. It's buried, but it's widespread. And so, if we're asking what the obstacles are to justice, to fairness, to a redistribution, to a more relational economics, to a refusal to return to normality and embrace business as usual, this kind of economic sadism may be a contribution from therapy thinking to thinking about taxation. And that's what I want to talk about next. And I'm moving into the last part of this, which is on sacrifice. Inheritance tax, called in the United States death tax, is a widespread global problematic. It's really difficult to explain exactly why there is such widespread opposition to death tax from people who will never have enough in their estates to pay it. It really upsets people because it sort of breaks the line in which humans want to give to their children. Now, it's a good thing to want to look after your children, but it's not a good thing if looking after your children is a prime mover in society's failure to look after everyone, the many, not the few. Now, of course, tax avoidance schemes, tax havens, clever lawyers will line up against any government, any treasury, any finance department that looks into inheritance tax, because inheritance tax would produce a lot of money and it would have an equalizing redistributive impact. But it's very difficult. I was talking to a young friend the other day, and the first thing she said was, well, people will just avoid it. Is this true? Isn't this where the state comes in? And isn't COVID showing us that those people who dismiss the state as an irrelevant, non-existent entity in political and social discourse are so wrong? I think this is where governments come in. And this is therefore where voters, electorates, and populations come in. The role of the state in connection with things like death tax, inheritance tax, and other major redistributive tax policies, the role of the state is really interesting. If you want to Google the best writer on this, it's Mariana Mazzucato, University College London, who writes really brilliantly about the role of the state in these kinds of matters. But sacrifice, which is what accepting high levels of death tax would mean, needs to be given a few minutes attention before I finish. Jungians know quite a lot about it, the sacrifice of the ego in the service of the self, the higher personality, the deeper personality, individuation. Artists know a lot about sacrifice. When you simply can't keep control of things, you simply cannot manage yourself. And I think the religions have a great deal of interest still in sacrifice. I mean, sacrifice is far older than Abraham and Isaac. It's about propitiation of the gods. I think that if we are going to talk about redistribution, economic reform, even economic revolution, a refusal to return to normality, then there is a role for therapists in explaining that sacrifice is a good idea and maybe achievable. So, concluding comments, and I will have been talking for 25 minutes. You're probably wondering, what do I think therapists and analysts could offer? Maybe we need to study again what liberation theologians, mainly in Latin America between 1950 and 1990, did. They reoriented the Roman Catholic Christian project in their countries. I think we have to reorient the psychoanalytic and depth psychological projects in our countries. I think, although the phrase has maybe been used to death, we do need liberation psychoanalysis, and we do need analysis and activism. I will conclude with a few words from a liberation theologian, Leonardo Boff, who some of you may remember in 2013 in Copenhagen was accepted by acclamation as an honorary member of the International Association for Analytical Psychology. Boff wrote, and it's part of a much longer piece, "God is in the poor who cry out, and God is the one who listens to the cry and liberates, so that the poor no longer need to cry out." I will end by going back to the 60s and that memorable slogan from Paris 68. Be realistic, demand the impossible. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. May I do this for everybody? That was a very moving talk. Questions yet? This is what I forgot at the beginning. Questions should be put to the chat box, and I will read them then to Andrew. We have one from Dennis Merritt. He wants to have some references about sustainable economic systems. Do you have something to give?
Oh, there is, Dennis, you know as well as anybody that there is a great deal of literature around changing economic assumptions and values with sustainability in mind. In the world of journalism, George Monbiot, the Guardian journalist, has written a great deal about it. Extinction Rebellion has literature on this, and actually it goes right the way back to Rachel Carson and the Silent Spring in the 1950s. So I don't think we're short of it. We may be short of agreement about which bits to get behind, but the main problem is the forces that don't want it. Isn't that the main issue? And isn't then the question for therapists, can we put our shoulder to the wheel that might make some of these policies happen? I personally like the idea of a universal basic income, and I won't say any more about it. You could Google that too. I'm sorry I'm putting in quite a few. Google. Next question.
There's a question from Stefano. He wants to know pathology of success, broken individualization versus learning to be satisfied with who are, the individuation.
Well, of course, the Western world is based on not being satisfied with who you are. It's all, and actually the Jungians are caught in this too. It's full of goals. It's full of assumptions to do with progress and with betterment. I mean, many people have written about the self-help industry, the psychological self-help industry. So it's really there. I agree with you, Steph, that it would be better, but I don't quite know how we get there, if people were content with less. I mean, when I was working as a consultant for Friends of the Earth, the statistical people said that if everybody on the planet lived at the level of 1959 Portugal, we would not have any issue to do with sustainability, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I don't know. I have no idea whether I could live in 1959 Portugal. But I think the usual feeling is that if lots of people agreed to try it, then it might get tried. The question is to get the critical mass. Next.
Okay. There's a question from Harry Fogarty. It says, the question is, role of the state presumes, presumes that the voters can succeed in voting effectively. The aims of leaders like Bolsonaro, Trump, and so on, who want to undo the possibilities of the state.
Yes, but the reason they want to control the state in the way they do is that they recognize the bad guys are always smarter. They recognize that if you hold the levers of state power and state control, you can do what you want.
Smarter, you mean more cunning.
So, I didn't hear that. So, what I would be thinking about is, what can voters do? Now, we know voters are manipulated, voters are ignorant, blah, 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 blah. It's obviously not a simple matter, and I don't mean to offer it as a simple matter. But it seems to me that the time to reflect on the potential benevolence of state energy is with us. Now, this for me is a huge jump, because for most of my life, I've seen the state as the enemy. The word state capitalism means the Soviet Union. State violence means the police. You know, we don't use the state in a very positive way. And I think Mariana and other people have led me to believe that this is worth thinking about. Next.
Sharon Pelton. One South American liberation theologian, Gutierrez, went to live amongst the poor and understand firsthand their dilemma. How do you correlate liberation from a psychological point of view in your call to do likewise? What does it require?
Well, if there is anything of interest in this talk, it is the remarks about the poor. Because there's an interesting split. I mean, the religions, whether it's to do with things like Jubilee years, which somebody asked a question about, but you haven't spotted it, or whether it's to do with charity or whatever it is, religion is interesting in this regard. So I think it's not surprising that it was theologians that began to talk about the problem of poverty. And I think that poverty underpins things that really worry us at the moment. Like, why is it that members of minority groups, Black and ethnic minorities, seem to have such a worse experience from the virus? Well, if you dig deep into it, this is what you find. And this was in research that's just been published. If members of minority groups go into hospital and get, of course, the same treatment in hospital as white patients, they do just as well. They get the disease more, but once they're in hospital, they don't die more. I have it here. It's really very interesting. Again, I'm not going to go into more detail, but if you wanted to Google Professor Adrian Hayday, the chair of the Department of Immunobiology at King's College, London. In studies of patients in London hospitals, Black, African, Asian, and minority groups show higher admission to hospital which shows they are more likely to have become infected under conditions where the virus doses may be high. But once they are in hospital, they do just as well as anybody. The hypothesis, says Hede, is that they are disproportionately suffering from socioeconomic factors that make them more likely to receive high frequency, high doses of infection. Next.
Yeah, there are two controversial ones. It's Harry Fogarty again. He asked again about the role of the state versus the voting, and reminds you of the difficulties in getting the IAAP to act on Jung and racism.
I never talk about the problems of getting the IAAP to act on questions of Jung and alleged racism. Next question.
Okay. That's Ada Gonzalez. How do you apply the liberation of psychoanalysis now that you state that there are only 3 Black analysts in the US, while you know as we talk that I'm the 4th, and you keep mentioning that there are only 3? How then we can move from Afrocentric to Eurocentric, in a view as opposed to a Eurocentric?
Yes, who is this from?
Ada Gonzalez.
Well, I owe Dr. Gonzalez an apology. I'm ignorant about it, but it's interesting. 2 things are interesting. First, that these questions are asked. So there is some growing interest in our little group in where the institutions of Jungian psychoanalysis stand in relation to economic issues such as class and money. And I think that there is a serious ethnic angle to pursue on this, not only in the United States. It's extremely expensive to become a Jungian analyst or a psychoanalyst. My colleague Elizabeth Cotton wrote a wonderful paper about 6 years ago. She is a psychological explorer of issues to do with employment and unemployment. And the title of the paper, broadly speaking, is it possible to train as a psychoanalyst if you are not married to a banker? So I think there is something here. And to be anecdotal about it, I've got into terrible trouble on a psychoanalytic list at protesting at the joy with which the very well-off psychoanalysts, and true of us too, regale us with the beautiful views from their second home up a hill on the coast, or even very shrewdly rented from Airbnb. And they are working and worrying about working online. Sally Swartz, who is a psychoanalyst in Cape Town, led the way here. She said, there are so many patients out there who cannot even, in South Africa, manage a telephone call to their analyst. And I think it has been close to grotesque, the celebration of wealth at our end of the therapy world. When you talk to Elizabeth Cotton, who not only looks at economic issues of unemployment and employment, but also is very interested in the economic location of the psychotherapy world, she has done surveys in Britain, it must be said, which show that the average income of counselors and therapists is so low, it's actually below the average earnings. But you wouldn't know this, and I'm as guilty as anyone, okay? I live high on the hog, to use the American expression. I love money. I'm a show-off, I'm an exhibitionist. I buy shoes that cost an arm and a leg. And I'm talking to you about poverty. It's a difficult one. Next question.
I have a question concerning the topic, if I may.
Yeah, Bernard, could you project your voice more? I simply can't hear you.
Yeah, I have a question concerning this topic. Is it okay now?
Yes, I'm carrying my speaker.
Okay. It's coming back to what you said about whiteness. Is there a relationship between whiteness and maleness? Can I say that?
Yeah, I did mention that women's disadvantage is also, whatever else it is also an economic matter. And it's absolutely clear that, if I can find it quickly, yeah, single parent families, lone parent families is sometimes called, across the world are headed by females. Not everyone, but 90%, something like this. In the COVID situation, it is these single parent families that are suffering the worst. There's data on this now from numerous Western countries. I don't know about Latin America, for example. So there really is a gendered element in all of this. In my workshops, I often ask people to to tell us about how money was handled in the home they grew up in, who made the decisions, who controlled it, who understood it, and was there a gendered element in this? And where there are two parents, it's very interesting to see that certain, what you might call gender stereotypes, operate. So you're very, very on the button. This choice of economics was done to enable me to address in one very short talk Black Lives Matter, COVID, the climate crisis, gender inequality, and although I slipped it in, I'm now going to maximize it, political violence.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm trying to do. I'm using economics in the way Jung and others use psychology. It's a little old-fashioned because I'm saying it's foundational. And those of us that grew up in a kind of postmodern, post-structuralist discourse world were told nothing is foundational. But I think if anything is foundational, economics with its subdivisions into class, wealth, success and failure, and so on, it is a foundational matter in relation to these topics. And in the many psychotherapy and psychoanalytic lists that I'm far too active on, wasting all my good ideas on a few sentences, we all do it, that disappear, nobody ever knows again. What I've noticed is that the economic dimension is insufficiently stressed. Now, please, I mean, there was a man whose first name began with K and whose second name began with M, whose tomb is regularly defaced in a cemetery in London, who said something similar about economics. So, you know, I'm following. Carl. Yeah, well, yeah, another Carl. Yeah, okay. Too many Carls. Next one.
There's a note from Susan Rowland on that. Jung mentions whiteness as a conscious. Jung. Oh, wait a minute. Jung mentions consciousness.
I found it. Jung mentions whiteness as a consciousness needing to be treated, the object-obsessed white man. Yes, I think that at his best, Jung's deconstruction of many of the problems facing Western societies is quite brilliant. The acquisitiveness, what we would call consumerism, all of this kind of thing is really important. I, to be honest, Susan, I didn't know that he linked whiteness to it. What Lula was saying was not, this isn't our problem here in Brazil. Here in Brazil, with the largest Africanist population outside of Africa, he wasn't saying it's not our problem, it's the white guy's problem. He was saying it is our problem, that it's the white guy's problem.
Mm-hmm.
The poor have a problem, and the problem may be named the rich. Now, is that too simple? Yeah, of course, of course. It is too simple. The poor have many, many problems. But I don't like what Jesus said, to be honest, that the poor will always be with you. I mean, he may be very realistic, and maybe it's true, but I don't, it gives me an uncomfortable feeling, because it makes me think in terms of Marie Antoinette, let them eat cake. Poverty, money, class. This is the next frontier for the therapy world. I really believe it.
And that's why it's psychosocial.
Well, I don't know. I don't think I invented the term psychosocial, by the way. I really didn't.
No, I didn't say that, but...
Okay, no, I didn't. And in fact, I think it's a very problematic term, because it has two meanings. It refers on the one hand, and by the way, here I would acknowledge the tuition I've received in this from Renos Papadopoulos, who also, with me, is worried that our Department of Essex is now psychosocial studies. You see, a psychosocial intervention into a war zone or into a famine or in a peacekeeping context refers to something that is informed by psychology and operates on the social plane. Psychosocial studies is the application of psychological theories and systems to the understanding of social problems. Now, I have no problem with the fact that these salons could be both. In fact, I'm not sure until this evening they've been either. And I think it's really interesting that the word psychosocial sits there. It's probably because Stefano understands how absolutely vital the psychosocial is. Jung, going back to Susan, if you read Jung in a friendly way, there is a psychosocial Jung, just as there is an equally problematic Jung who is not too keen on the working class, and certainly isn't too keen on left-wingers, and hates Bolsheviks, communists, actually, and Russians, and lots of other people.
Yeah, there's a question again from Stefano. Mary Watkins, who you suggested me to read, works on the concept of liberation, and following Frère, she underlined that liberation is only possible when we meet the other. And the other is the other in us, the other in our neighbors, and the other in nature. What is your take?
Yeah, well, I'm sure she's right. In my work, I don't go there. I'll tell you why. Look, I have the greatest respect for her, and she does use the word liberation a bit differently from me, but she does use it, and we've both been writing about it for a long time. I probably come over as a preacher sometimes, but I can't stand preachiness. And to be told that you can only do something if you get in touch with something in yourself, and then you do something in relation to the other. I mean, it sounds a little bit abstract. There's not enough sweatiness in it for me. It sounds instructional. It sounds uplifting, and it can't be wrong. You see, this is one of the big problems with psychology in general. Virtually everything that gets said, it cannot be wrong. I mean, there's something in it. But I do think well, anyway, I don't do that. I admire people who do what Mary Watkins does, but I don't. Sorry, I'll say that again. I admire what Mary Watkins does, but I have some trouble with saying you can only do this if that. And this actually does come from Jung. And those of you who are in the International Association for Jungian Studies will remember the huge debate about what Jung meant when he referred to stunted people who could not individuate. A stunted person. Stunt, for those of you who don't have English as a first language, it's not a very nice word. A stunted person is not a full person, hasn't grown to fullness in any sense. And then when you unpick it, and I was saying to the organizers at the beginning, if you unpick it a bit, uneducated, working class, impoverished people who don't have Latin or Greek and think that alchemy is the name of a hip hop band. Can they individuate? Adolf Guggenbull Craig was very interesting on this in his book, Eros on Crutches, but I don't want to say any more about this. And my mentor, Fred Plaut, said over and over, individuation is not a mental health concept. So I don't like the idea of stunted people. And I think Leonardo Boff and the other liberation theologians were saying that the stone that the builder rejected has become the keystone, the capstone of the temple. They repositioned the poor. And I think we can reposition the poor, the homeless, the demonstrators, the kids. These people are not ones that the mainstream media and the mainstream politicians should reject. They are the cornerstone of some sort of new temple. Now I'm sounding really like a preacher, but anyway. You have to, I hope people don't mind, these Zooms have to have some, because I'm talking and I'm not hearing another voice except Bernhard, and I can't hear him anyway. So it seems to me you have to play around with it quite a lot. So forgive me if I'm saying a few hyperbolic things, but let's not forget what Adorno said about psychoanalysis, that the only true things in psychoanalysis are the exaggerations.
I think this is a good closing remark. That hour is over. Thank you very much, Andrew. Thank you very much.
Could I ask everybody to Google the Rolling Stones playing under lockdown? Oh, Paul is waving, I suppose it's a finger. Can you play it?
Yes, finally. I'm sorry. I need to, oh geez, watch, this isn't going to work again, is it?
More analysis, mate.
Yes, it's clearly a personal flaw.
Ah, now it's going.
Ah, and no sound. What is wrong? I have no idea. I'm clearly cursed.
Or I am.
I apologize to everyone for everything I've ever done.
Try one more time. Just try one more time.
Right. Let me see. I don't know why this wouldn't.
It worked before you, didn't it?
Yes, it doesn't make any sense. I apologize to everyone. I don't know what's wrong. It's a lovely video. You'll have to see it on your own.
Oh, there it was. At the bottom.
Where? I'm not hearing anything. It's very frustrating. I apologize, as I say, for my entire life.
I will, everybody, I can only do it on two lists, IAJS and analysis and activism. I will post the link.
We will post the link on our Facebook page.
I think I'd rather do it myself.
Okay. So thank you very much, Andrew. That was very inspiring, I must say. I was glued to what you said. I hope it was the same experience for everybody else. And I want to remember that in 2 weeks' time, we have Marianne Meister-Notter. And she is talking about, wait a minute, astrological typology and relationships. See you in 2 weeks' time. And thank you very much for everybody.